Snow fell in silence upon Thornwood Manor, each flake descending like a whispered accusation against the grey December sky, blanketing the ancient estate in a shroud of white that seemed to mirror the cold fury radiating from within its stone walls. The servants moved through the corridors with hushed steps and downcast eyes, their whispers carrying the scandal that would stain these halls for generations to come. Lady Eleanor Ashford, the Duchess of Thornwood, wife of Lord Adrian Blackwood for 2 years, was being led away in disgrace, banished like a common criminal from the only home she had known since her marriage. In the great hall, where firelight cast dancing shadows across portraits of Blackwood ancestors who stared down with stern disapproval, Eleanor stood with her hands folded before her, her face pale as the snow outside, her dark eyes fixed upon some distant point, as though she could will herself away from this moment, from the man who stood before her with such terrible rage in his countenance. Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Thornwood, a man whose very name commanded respect and whose military reputation had been built upon unwavering loyalty and tactical brilliance, felt betrayal burn through his veins like poison. The evidence lay before him on the mahogany desk. Letters in his wife's delicate handwriting, correspondence intercepted by his network of informants, each one detailing troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans that should never have left the confines of his study. She had met with known enemy agents, this he knew with certainty, had passed secrets that could have destroyed him, that could have led to the deaths of his men, to the downfall of everything he had sworn to protect. "Have you nothing to say?" His voice, when it came, was harsh as winter wind, and Eleanor flinched almost imperceptibly, the only sign that she was not carved from marble. She looked at him then, and in her eyes he saw not the defiance he expected, not the cunning of a spy caught in her treachery, but something that looked disturbingly like sorrow, like acceptance of a fate she had known would come. "I have nothing to say, my lord," she whispered, and her voice trembled only slightly, a leaf barely stirred by autumn's breath. Adrian's jaw clenched, his hands fisting at his sides as he struggled against the urge to demand answers, to shake the truth from her, to understand how the woman who had sat across from him at breakfast, who had tended the garden with such gentle care, who had begun, just begun, to make him feel something other than the emptiness he had carried since the war, could have betrayed him so completely. "Then you leave me no choice," he said, and the words fell like stones into deep water. "You are banished from Thornwood, from all my properties, from society itself. You will take nothing but what you wear, and will depart within the hour." Eleanor nodded once, a slight inclination of her head, and turned toward the door where the housekeeper waited with tears streaming down her weathered face. On the desk, beneath the damning letters, lay a sealed envelope in Eleanor's hand, addressed simply to Adrian. But he did not see it then, his vision clouded by rage and the terrible ache of what he believed was her betrayal. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The carriage that bore Eleanor away from Thornwood rattled over frozen roads toward the northern border of Adrian's vast holdings, toward a cottage so remote that even the nearest village lay 3 miles distant, a place where disgrace could be hidden from polite society's prying eyes, where a fallen duchess might live out her days in the obscurity her supposed crimes demanded. Eleanor sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her thin cloak pulled tight against the December cold that seeped through the carriage walls, and as the miles stretched between herself and the only home she had known these past 2 years, memory overtook her with the force of a winter gale, carrying her back to the beginning, to the day her father had informed her of the arrangement with the Duke of Thornwood, a military hero recently returned from the wars, a man of impeccable lineage and vast fortune who required a wife to secure his line and manage his household. She had been 20 then, hopeful despite the mercenary nature of the arrangement, for she had heard tales of the Duke's honor, his courage, his devotion to duty, and she had allowed herself to dream that perhaps duty might grow into something warmer, something true. How naive she had been, standing in Thornwood's chapel on their wedding day, meeting Adrian's grey eyes for the first time, and finding there only cool assessment, the gaze of a man fulfilling an obligation, nothing more. The months that followed had been a study in loneliness. Adrian polite but distant, his days consumed with estate business and military consultations, his evenings spent in his study with maps and correspondence, while Eleanor wandered the vast manor like a ghost, trying to make a home of rooms that echoed with emptiness, trying to build warmth where none existed. She had persevered, tending the gardens with her own hands despite the head gardener's protests, establishing charitable works in the village, learning the names of every servant, reading the books in Adrian's library, and leaving notes in the margins that she hoped he might find, and perhaps, see her as more than the necessary acquisition she knew herself to be. And slowly, so slowly she had barely dared to hope, something had begun to shift. Adrian asking her opinion on a matter of estate management, accepting her invitation to walk the gardens at sunset, the ghost of a smile when she made a clever observation at dinner, the night he had almost reached for her hand before catching himself, the warmth creeping into his voice when he bid her good night. 2 years of patient cultivation, of gentle persistence, of loving him from a careful distance, and just when the frozen ground between them had begun to thaw, when she had started to believe that affection might truly take root, the enemy had struck, not at Adrian directly, but at her, at the one weakness she could never fortify. Her younger brother Thomas, captured during his military service, held hostage in conditions she dared not imagine, his life the price of her cooperation. The letters she had been forced to copy, the meetings with men whose eyes held nothing but calculation and cruelty, the careful dance of appearing to betray while feeding them useless information, praying that Adrian's brilliance would see through the false intelligence, that Thomas would survive, that somehow this nightmare would end without destroying everything. It had all been for nothing, for here she was, banished and branded traitor, unable to speak the truth that would endanger both the men she loved most, accepting damnation as the only path that might yet save them. Weeks passed, and Thornwood Manor settled into a silence that felt less like peace and more like the aftermath of battle, when the smoke has cleared, but the cost becomes visible in the empty spaces where the fallen once stood, and Adrian found himself wandering rooms that seemed larger now, emptier, though nothing physical had changed except the absence of one slender woman who had moved through these halls like a whisper he had barely acknowledged until she was gone. He told himself that his sleeplessness was merely the restlessness of a mind accustomed to military campaigns and strategic planning, that the hollow feeling in his chest was satisfaction at having protected his household from betrayal, that justice had been served and he should feel vindicated. Yet vindication tasted like ash, and sleep eluded him night after night as he lay staring at the canopy of his bed, seeing again and again that last look in Eleanor's eyes. Not the defiance of a spy caught in her treachery, not the hatred of a wife wronged, but something that haunted him far more deeply. A sorrow so profound it seemed to contain depths he had never bothered to explore, an acceptance that spoke of sacrifices he could not begin to understand. He noticed things he had been too consumed with anger to see before. Her books left open in the library, pages marked with her careful notations, observations about estate management and agricultural improvements that showed a mind far more engaged with Thornwood's welfare than he had credited. And when he walked past the gardens she had tended with her own hands, he saw how they had begun to wither without her care, the roses drooping as though mourning their mistress, the herb garden growing wild and untended despite the groundskeeper's efforts, for it had been Eleanor's touch, Eleanor's gentle persistence that had coaxed such beauty from the earth. The village sent inquiries about the charitable works she had established, the school for tenant children that would close without her patronage, the widow's fund she had personally administered, the sick she had visited with her own hands despite his butler's protests about propriety, and Adrian realized with growing discomfort that Eleanor had woven herself into the fabric of Thornwood in ways he had never bothered to observe, had created something real and good, while he had dismissed her as merely the necessary ornament of his household. His friend and confidant, Captain James Hartford, visited on a February afternoon when frost still clung to the windows, and over brandy in the study, Hartford studied Adrian with the shrewd gaze of a man who had served beside him through blood and fire, who knew when something troubled the Duke beyond the usual concerns of estate and politics. "Are you certain of what you saw, Adrian?" Hartford asked carefully, swirling amber liquid in his glass, and Adrian felt anger flash through him at the question, at the doubt it implied. "The evidence was irrefutable," Adrian said, but even as he spoke the words, they felt rehearsed, hollow, a shield against the whispers of uncertainty that had begun to plague his thoughts. "Evidence can be manufactured," Hartford observed mildly, "and I wonder, my friend, why a woman accused of treason would accept banishment without a single word in her own defense. Why she would not rage or weep or plead innocence as any guilty person would, knowing that silence sealed her fate." Adrian had no answer, could only dismiss his friend's concerns with a wave of his hand. But that night he lay awake once more, haunted not by certainty, but by doubt, by the ghost of sorrow in Eleanor's eyes, by the terrible possibility that he had made a mistake whose consequences he could not yet comprehend. The cottage that had become Eleanor's prison sat at the edge of a dark wood where winter winds howled through bare branches like the keening of ghosts. A structure so small and mean that the entirety of it would have fit inside Thornwood's entrance hall, with walls that let in the cold, and a hearth that devoured what little firewood she could gather from the frozen forest. And here Eleanor lived in a poverty she had never known, her modest allowance barely sufficient for bread and coal, her days consumed with the simple struggle to survive that left little room for the grief that might otherwise have destroyed her, though in the nights, in the long, dark nights when wind rattled the shutters and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air, memory came to her unbidden and relentless, carrying her back to moments she had treasured without knowing how precious they would become. The evening Adrian had joined her for dinner and actually laughed at something she said, a genuine sound of surprised delight that had made her heart soar with foolish hope. The afternoon they had walked together through Thornwood's gardens, and his hand had brushed hers, lingering perhaps a moment longer than accident would explain. The night she had found him in the library late, and he had looked up from his maps with an expression almost tender, had nearly spoken words that died unborn on his lips, but left their ghost in his eyes, had made her believe that perhaps he was learning to care for her as she had come to care for him, with a love that had grown quietly in the shadows of their arrangement until it filled her entire heart. A love she had never spoken aloud, and now never could. She tended a small garden plot behind the cottage when the ground permitted, coaxing winter vegetables from the reluctant earth with the same patient devotion she had once offered to the roses at Thornwood, and sometimes she wrote letters she would never send, pouring onto paper all the words she could not speak, explanations and apologies and assurances that Thomas was safe, that the intelligence she had provided was worthless, that Adrian need never fear she had truly betrayed him. Though what did it matter now? What good were explanations when he had already judged and condemned her, when the very sight of her must fill him with disgust and rage? But even in her exile, even in her acceptance of this fate, she prayed for him, whispered entreaties to a God who seemed as distant as the husband she had lost, begging that Adrian be kept safe, that the enemies who had used her so cruelly would never succeed in harming him, that he would live long and well, even if she could not be part of that life. And as winter deepened, and a cough began to rattle in her chest, as her strength waned, and each day became a battle against cold and hunger, and an illness. She lacked the resources to properly tend. Eleanor found a strange peace in the knowledge that she had at least done this one thing right, had protected him even at the cost of everything she held dear, had loved him enough to let him hate her if that was what his safety required. Though sometimes, in fevered dreams, she imagined a different world where truth could be spoken, where Adrian looked at her again with warmth instead of contempt, where the love she had glimpsed growing between them had been allowed to bloom, rather than crushed beneath the weight of circumstances she had been powerless to prevent. Captain Hartford arrived at Thornwood on a morning when March winds rattled the windows and brought with them the faint promise of spring, though Adrian scarcely noticed the changing season, too consumed with the restless unease that had plagued him since their last conversation. The seeds of doubt Hartford had planted growing into thorny vines that wrapped themselves around his certainty and squeezed until breathing felt difficult. And when his friend entered the study with an expression grave enough to silence even Adrian's greeting, the Duke felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition of truths he was not prepared to face. "There has been an attempt on your life," Hartford said without preamble, laying a dispatch on Adrian's desk with hands that trembled slightly, a detail that frightened Adrian more than the words themselves, for Hartford was not a man given to visible emotion, had faced cavalry charges and cannon fire with steadier hands than these. "Last night, in London, an assassin entered your townhouse. Thank God you were here at Thornwood, or we would be having a very different conversation, my friend." Adrian stared at the report, reading of poison meant for his evening wine, of a servant's chance discovery, of the assassin's capture and subsequent death before he could be questioned, and felt the world tilt beneath him as Hartford continued speaking, his voice tight with something that sounded like barely controlled fury. "This is the plot you thought Eleanor exposed, Adrian, the great conspiracy you believed she revealed through her supposed treachery, except it has succeeded in a different form entirely, which makes no sense if she was truly working with your enemies, for why would they still be attempting to kill you if she had already provided them the intelligence they needed?" The logic was irrefutable, damning, and Adrian felt his carefully constructed narrative of betrayal begin to crumble like ancient stone. "Perhaps they no longer trust her," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears, desperate. Hartford shook his head and produced another document from his coat, this one sealed with wax that had been broken, edges charred as though rescued from flames. "This was found during a raid on an enemy safe house 3 days ago, recovered from papers they were burning when our soldiers arrived. Read it, Adrian, and tell me again that your wife was their ally." Adrian's hands shook as he unfolded the document, scanned words written in a language he barely understood, but Hartford had thoughtfully translated in the margins, and there, amid discussions of military movements and strategic positions, he found a single line that struck him like a physical blow. "The Duke's wife remains an obstacle. Her interference has cost us valuable time, and she must be removed from the equation before we proceed." Not an ally, an obstacle. Not a conspirator, but an interference. Someone who had cost them time, someone they wanted removed. And Adrian felt the room spin as Hartford's voice came from very far away, saying something about evidence that didn't align, about inconsistencies he should have noticed earlier, about the possibility that they had all been deceived. "I have been such a fool," Adrian whispered, and the certainty that had sustained him through weeks of Eleanor's absence shattered completely, leaving only the terrible understanding that he might have condemned an innocent woman, that the sorrow in her eyes had been real and justified, that every sleepless night and every moment of hollow victory had been his conscience trying to tell him what his pride refused to hear. And now, God help him, he needed to know the truth before it destroyed them both. Adrian began his investigation in secret, telling no one save Hartford of his intentions, for he could not bear the thought of raising false hope or appearing the fool if his suspicions proved unfounded, though in his heart he already knew with terrible certainty that he had wronged Eleanor beyond measure, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone that grew heavier with each new revelation he uncovered. He started with the meetings that had formed the backbone of his accusations, visiting the locations where Eleanor had allegedly conspired with enemy agents, and at each place he found witnesses Hertford had not thought to question thoroughly before, people who remembered the Duke's wife not with the calculating composure of a spy, but with expressions of barely concealed anguish, a street vendor who recalled how her hands had shaken as she waited outside a tavern, a shopkeeper who had seen her emerge from one such meeting with tears streaming down her pale cheeks, details that spoke not of conspiracy, but of desperation, of a woman trapped in circumstances beyond her control. At the Rose and Crown, a tavern on London's seedier edges, where Eleanor had been seen with a known foreign agent, the proprietor, a grizzled man named Simmons, who had served soldiers in his youth, studied Adrian with shrewd eyes before speaking words that cut like knives. "Your lady wife came here 3 times that I recall, and each time she asked after her brother, kept demanding to know if Thomas Ashford was alive, if there was any way to secure his release, and that snake she met with, he played her like a fiddle, made promises he never intended to keep, and I could see it was breaking her heart, but she kept coming back, kept asking, kept hoping." Thomas Ashford, Eleanor's younger brother, a name Adrian had heard perhaps twice in their 2 years of marriage, a young officer serving abroad, whom Adrian had dismissed from his thoughts entirely, too absorbed in his own affairs to pay attention to his wife's family. And now the mention of that name opened a chasm of understanding that threatened to swallow him whole. He returned to Thornwood and tore through Eleanor's correspondence, the letters he had used as evidence of her treachery. And this time he read them with different eyes, noticed that each one coincided not with military movements or strategic decisions, but with personal dates, with Thomas's birthday, with the anniversary of their father's death, with holidays when a sister might naturally think of an absent brother, and the pattern that emerged was not one of calculated espionage, but of frantic attempts to save someone she loved, each meeting with enemy agents corresponding perfectly with another desperate plea for news of Thomas, another bargain struck to keep her brother alive. Hertford joined him in the library as dawn broke, found Adrian surrounded by papers and maps and timelines, his face haggard with shame and growing horror, and together they pieced together the truth that Adrian's rage had blinded him to before, that Eleanor had been caught in an impossible choice between her husband's safety and her brother's life, that she had tried to walk an invisible line between betrayal and sacrifice, that every action he had condemned as treason had been an act of desperate love for those she held most dear, and the realization that he had punished her for protecting him had banished her for a courage he had been too proud and too foolish to recognize, brought Adrian to his knees beside his desk, tears of rage and remorse streaming down his face, as he understood at last the magnitude of what he had done to an innocent woman whose only crime had been loving too well and too selflessly to defend herself at the cost of others' lives. The complete truth emerged like a body rising from dark water, piece by terrible piece, as Adrian traced the chain of events back to its origins in a military campaign 18 months prior, when Lieutenant Thomas Ashford had been reported missing after a skirmish near the border, presumed captured, but with no official confirmation, no ransom demands through proper channels, nothing but silence that had apparently driven Eleanor to desperate measures Adrian had been too self-absorbed to notice, and through contacts in the War Office and interviews with Thomas's commanding officers, Adrian learned that enemy agents had indeed taken the young lieutenant prisoner, had held him in conditions too horrific to contemplate, and had used him as leverage against his sister in a plot so cunningly designed that Adrian himself had played perfectly into their hands by believing the worst of his wife without question. Hertford helped him reconstruct the timeline, matching Eleanor's meetings with the coded letters Adrian had intercepted, and what had seemed like damning evidence of espionage revealed itself instead as a masterwork of misdirection. Eleanor had copied information, yes, but always intelligence that was outdated or subtly altered, troop movements that had already occurred, strategic plans that had been abandoned, supply routes no longer in use, feeding her brother's captors just enough to keep them believing she was cooperating while actually providing nothing of value, protecting Adrian's interests even as she sacrificed her own reputation and safety to keep Thomas alive. The letters she had written in her own hand, the ones Adrian had used to condemn her, had been dictated by the enemy agents who held her brother, and she had transcribed them exactly as instructed because deviation meant Thomas's death. But she had also, Adrian now understood with dawning admiration and crushing guilt, embedded tiny inconsistencies that would have alerted anyone actually paying attention, dates that didn't quite align, details that contradicted known facts, subtle signals that this information was unreliable, signals Adrian had been too blinded by wounded pride to recognize, too ready to believe betrayal because believing in Eleanor's love would have required him to acknowledge his own growing feelings and the vulnerability they represented. The enemy's plan had been elegant in its cruelty. Force Eleanor to appear to betray her husband, drive a wedge between them, isolate her from Adrian's protection, and then, once she was banished and helpless, extract real intelligence through threats against both Thomas and Adrian himself, using her continued love for them both as the weapon to compel her cooperation. Except Eleanor had somehow managed to orchestrate Thomas's escape before that final phase could be executed, had played her part so convincingly that even Adrian had been deceived while simultaneously working behind the scenes to save her brother, and the realization that she had been protecting him at every turn, that her apparent treachery had been the deepest form of loyalty, that she had endured his hatred and condemnation without defending herself because doing so would have endangered both the men she loved, brought Adrian to a moment of moral reckoning so profound that he could scarcely breathe beneath the weight of his own blindness and cruelty, understanding at last that he had not banished a traitor, but a hero, had not protected himself from betrayal, but had himself become the betrayer, and the woman suffering in exile because of his pride and suspicion had saved his life, while he had very nearly destroyed hers. Adrian found Thomas Ashford 3 days later in a military hospital outside London, recovering from his ordeal in captivity, and the young lieutenant looked up from his bed with eyes that held the haunted quality of a man who had seen too much darkness, his face gaunt and marked with scars that spoke of brutal treatment. But when Adrian introduced himself as Eleanor's husband, Thomas's expression transformed into something approaching joy, relief flooding his features as he grasped Adrian's hand with surprising strength and said, "Thank God you've come, Your Grace. I have been desperate to write to Eleanor, but they tell me I must regain my strength first, and I need her to know that I am safe, that her sacrifice was not in vain." Words that struck Adrian like physical blows, because Thomas clearly had no idea what had transpired, no knowledge that his sister had been banished and condemned, living in exile while he recovered in comfort. And Adrian felt his throat constrict with shame as he asked Thomas to tell him everything, to explain what sacrifice he meant, bracing himself for confirmation of truths he had already pieced together, but needed to hear spoken aloud. Thomas's story emerged in fragments punctuated by moments when emotion overwhelmed him, describing his capture during what was supposed to be a routine patrol, the months of imprisonment in conditions designed to break a man's spirit, the enemy officers who had eventually come to him with their proposition, cooperate and provide information about his brother-in-law the Duke's affairs, or watch as they used his sister Eleanor to obtain what they wanted instead. And Thomas had refused, had endured increased torture rather than betray his family, but then they had shown him letters Eleanor had written, proof that she was already cooperating to save him, and he had realized with devastating clarity that his sister was sacrificing everything to keep him alive, was playing a dangerous game with enemy agents who would kill her without hesitation if she proved useless to them. "She orchestrated my escape, Your Grace," Thomas said, his voice breaking with admiration and grief. "She convinced our captors that I had intelligence value, that if they moved me to a different location for interrogation, I could provide information about troop movements, and she gave them just enough genuine details to make the lie believable, details that must have cost her dearly to obtain. And during the transfer, I was able to overpower my guards and flee, made it back to our lines half dead from exposure and wounds. And the whole time I kept thinking of Eleanor's courage, how she had warned me in coded messages hidden in those letters they forced her to write, that I must never tell you what she had done, must never reveal her involvement because it would endanger you both, must let her bear this burden alone because your safety and mine were worth any price she had to pay." Adrian listened with tears streaming unchecked down his face, each word another nail in the coffin of his own self-regard, understanding that while Thomas had been escaping captivity, Adrian had been condemning Eleanor to exile, that while this brave young man had been fighting his way back to safety, believing his sister safe in her husband's protection, Eleanor had been slowly dying alone because Adrian had been too proud and too blind to see the truth that had been before him all along. And when Thomas finally asked, his face bright with innocent expectation, "How is my sister, Your Grace? Is she well? Does she know I am safe?" Adrian had to confess what he had done, had to watch the light die in Thomas's eyes and be replaced by horror and fury, and a grief so profound that the young lieutenant wept as though his heart was breaking, mourning not his own suffering, but his sister's undeserved punishment. And Adrian knew in that moment that whatever forgiveness he might eventually earn from Eleanor, he would never forgive himself for failing to trust the woman who had proven herself worthy of devotion beyond all measure. Adrian left London within the hour, not even stopping to gather proper travelling clothes, his only thought to reach Eleanor before time itself conspired against him, before whatever suffering she had endured in exile exacted its final price. And Captain Hertford insisted on accompanying him despite Adrian's protests, saying quietly that Eleanor would need a physician and someone to help if she was truly as ill as Adrian feared. And so they rode north through weather that seemed to mirror Adrian's internal tempest, sleet giving way to snow as they pressed their horses harder than wisdom allowed, stopping only to change mounts at posting houses where Adrian paced like a caged animal while fresh horses were saddled, unable to rest, unable to eat, tormented by visions of Eleanor alone and suffering while he had been comfortable at Thornwood, condemning her in his heart. The journey that had taken her 2 days in a slow carriage they completed in less than 30 hours of brutal riding, and with each mile Adrian's anguish deepened, remembering her pale face the day he had banished her, the way she had not defended herself or begged for mercy, the dignity with which she had accepted his judgment. And he understood now that her silence had been one final act of protection, that she had taken his hatred upon herself, rather than risk exposing the truth that might have endangered both Thomas and Adrian, had chosen exile and disgrace over any possibility of harm coming to those she loved. And the magnitude of her sacrifice, set against the smallness of his faith in her, made him want to rail against the heavens and his own blindness with equal fury. Hertford tried several times to make him rest, pointing out that he would be no use to Eleanor if he collapsed from exhaustion, but Adrian pressed on, driven by a terror he could not name but felt in his bones. Some premonition that every moment wasted brought Eleanor closer to slipping beyond his reach forever. And when they finally crested the hill that overlooked the valley where the cottage stood, Adrian's heart seized in his chest, because the small stone building looked abandoned. No smoke rising from the chimney despite the bitter cold. Snow drifted against the door, as though no one had passed through it in days. The windows dark and lifeless. And he spurred his exhausted horse down the slope, with Hertford calling after him to be careful, to wait. But Adrian could not wait, could not be careful, could only think of Eleanor inside that cold cottage alone and frightened or worse. And he flung himself from the saddle before his horse had fully stopped, stumbling through snow that reached his knees, shouting her name, though the wind tore the words from his lips. And when he reached the door and found it unlocked, He knew with terrible certainty that something was very wrong, because Eleanor would never have left the cottage unsecured unless she had been unable to secure it. And he pushed inside with Hartford close behind him, calling for Eleanor in a voice that cracked with desperation, and in the dim light that filtered through ice-glazed windows, he saw the cottage's single room in disarray, as though she had tried to maintain order, but had gradually lost the strength. And then he saw her, a small form huddled beneath inadequate blankets near the cold hearth, so still that for one heart-stopping moment he thought he had arrived too late, thought that his cruelty had killed the woman who had saved his life, and he was across the room in 3 strides, falling to his knees beside her, reaching for her with hands that shook, whispering her name like a prayer he had no right to speak. Eleanor's skin burned with fever when Adrian touched her face, and her eyes, when they fluttered open at the contact, held no recognition, only the glazed confusion of delirium, and she whispered something he could not understand, words that might have been his name or might have been prayers, and Adrian gathered her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his desperation, shocked by how light she had become, how fragile. This woman who had once moved through Thornwood's halls with such quiet grace now felt as though she might break beneath the weight of his touch, and he called for Hartford with a voice that cracked, shouting that they needed a physician immediately, that Eleanor was dying, and Hartford was already moving, his military training evident in the swift efficiency with which he assessed the situation and promised to ride for the nearest doctor, to return within hours no matter what it took. And then Adrian was alone with Eleanor in that cold cottage, alone with the consequences of his cruelty made manifest in her wasted form and laboured breathing, and he carried her to the narrow bed, tried to warm her with his own coat and every blanket he could find, built up the fire with hands that shook so badly he could barely strike the flint. And all the while she murmured in her fever fragments of thoughts that pierced him like arrows, because in her delirium she could not guard her heart, could not hide the truths she had kept locked away during her exile. "Thomas must be safe," she whispered against Adrian's chest as he held her. "Please, God, let Thomas be safe. I promised Mother I would protect him, promised I would keep him from harm no matter the cost." And then later, her voice so faint he had to lean close to hear, "Adrian will be safe now. The false intelligence will mislead them. He will not know how close death came, will not know that I chose his life over my own happiness, over everything." And Adrian wept openly as he listened, pressing his face against her hair, begging her forgiveness, though she could not hear him through the fever's grip. And sometimes she called his name in tones of such longing that he wanted to die from the pain of it, wanted to trade places with her, to bear the suffering he had inflicted through his blind pride and wounded vanity. Hours passed in agony as he fought to keep her warm, to coax water past her cracked lips, to will her to survive through sheer force of desperate love. And in her fevered rambling, she spoke of moments he had forgotten or never fully noticed. The night at Thornwood, when he had smiled at something she said, and she had treasured that smile like a precious gift. The morning he had asked about her charity work, and she had dared to hope he might be learning to care for her. The afternoon in the garden when their hands had touched, and she had felt such joy at the simple contact that she had written about it in a diary he had never known existed, and with each revelation Adrian understood more fully what he had destroyed, what treasure he had cast aside in his arrogance, believing himself wronged when in truth he had been loved with a devotion he had never deserved and certainly had never earned. And when Hartford finally returned with the elderly physician from the village, the doctor's face grew grave as he examined Eleanor, and he told Adrian in tones that offered little comfort that she was very ill indeed, that months of poor nutrition and exposure had weakened her beyond what most constitutions could bear, that the lung infection that ravaged her now was precisely the sort of illness that claimed lives under such circumstances, and all they could do was keep her comfortable, keep her warm, pray that her spirit proved stronger than her failing body, and Adrian refused to accept this pronouncement, refused to believe that he would lose her now when he had finally understood the depth of his own love and the magnitude of her sacrifice. And so he stayed beside her through that first terrible night and into the dawn, holding her hand, speaking to her of things he should have said months ago, promising her a future he prayed she would live to see. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of desperate vigil as Adrian refused to leave Eleanor's side, sleeping in the chair beside her bed when exhaustion finally claimed him, waking at the slightest change in her breathing, and the physician came twice daily to check her condition, his expression growing more concerned with each visit as the fever refused to break and Eleanor's strength continued to ebb away like water draining from cupped hands. And he told Adrian with the blunt honesty of a country doctor who had seen too much death to offer false comfort that the next few days would determine whether the Duchess lived or slipped beyond all earthly aid, that her will to survive mattered as much as any medicine he could provide. And Adrian nodded without truly hearing, because he had already decided that Eleanor would live, that he would not permit the universe to take her from him now when he had finally understood what he had possessed and so carelessly destroyed. And so he talked to her through her delirium, confessing everything he had learned about Thomas and the enemy agents and the terrible game she had played to save them both, his voice breaking as he described finding her brother and learning the full extent of her sacrifice, how she had protected Adrian's life while he had repaid her courage with exile and condemnation, and he begged her forgiveness with words that came from depths of shame he had not known he could reach, telling her that he had been a fool blinded by wounded pride, that he had been afraid of the feelings she stirred in him, and had seized upon the accusation as justification to push her away before she could reach the parts of his heart he had sworn to keep protected after his parents' loveless marriage had taught him that caring was weakness and trust was folly. In the quiet hours of night when Hertford had finally succumbed to exhaustion in the cottage's other room and the fire burned low, Adrian spoke to Eleanor of moments he had treasured without admitting it even to himself. The morning she had laughed at his dry observation about the pompous ambassador, and her laugh had been like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The afternoon he had found her reading in the library, and had sat nearby with his own book simply to be in her presence. Though he had told himself it was mere coincidence, the evening she had worn blue silk to dinner, and he had been struck speechless by her beauty, but had hidden his reaction behind cold formality because he had not known how to navigate the dangerous waters of genuine feeling, and he told her unconscious form that he had been falling in love with her in those final weeks before the accusation, that he had been terrified by the vulnerability she inspired, and had almost been relieved when the evidence of her supposed betrayal had given him excuse to retreat behind anger and righteousness. And this admission cost him more than all the rest, because it meant acknowledging that he had wanted to believe the worst of her, had chosen suspicion over faith, because faith required courage. He had lacked, and he wept as he confessed this ugliest truth, his tears falling on her fevered face as he begged her to live so he could spend the rest of his days proving himself worthy of the love she had given so freely, and that he had trampled beneath his boots, promising her that if she would only open her eyes and come back to him, he would devote every breath to her happiness, would never again doubt her, would love her with all the fierce devotion he should have offered from the beginning. The fever broke on the fourth morning as pale sunlight filtered through the cottage window, and Eleanor's eyes opened with clarity for the first time in days, no longer glazed with delirium but confused and searching. And when her gaze found Adrian sitting beside her bed, his face haggard from sleepless nights and wet with tears he had not realized he was shedding, she whispered his name as a question, as though she could not quite believe he was real, and not another fever dream conjured by her failing mind. And Adrian reached for her hand with such desperate gentleness that his own trembled, bringing her fingers to his lips as he wept openly, telling her she had come back to him, that she lived. And Eleanor stared at him with wonder that slowly transformed into something more painful, as consciousness returned and brought with it memory of all that had passed between them. And she tried to pull her hand away, tried to turn her face from him, because surely he had come only from duty, or perhaps to witness her final punishment. But Adrian held fast and begged her to listen, to let him explain everything he had learned, and so in a voice hoarse from confession and sorrow, he told her about Thomas, about the enemy plot she had unraveled through her terrible courage, about his investigation and the truth that had destroyed his certainty and revealed the magnitude of his crime against her. And with each word Eleanor's eyes grew wider and more bright with tears, until finally she interrupted him with words so soft he had to lean close to hear them, saying that she would do it all again, that saving Thomas and protecting Adrian had been worth any price, including her own life, that she regretted only that Adrian had suffered from believing her a traitor, and this selfless declaration broke something in Adrian that had remained stubbornly intact through all his anguish, and he confessed then what he had barely admitted to himself during those dark vigil hours, that he had been afraid of loving her, that their arranged marriage had been safe until she had begun to reach past his defenses with her kindness and quiet strength and gentle persistence. That when the accusation had come, he had seized upon it almost with relief, because it had given him excuse to retreat behind anger rather than face the terrifying vulnerability of caring for someone who might leave him or prove as cold as his own parents had been to each other. And he told her with shame thick in his voice that he had wanted to believe the worst, because doubt would have required him to trust, and trust would have required him to acknowledge that he was already falling in love with her, and could not bear the thought of such dependence on another soul. And Eleanor listened to this confession with tears streaming down her pale cheeks, and when he finally fell silent, she reached up with the little strength she possessed and touched his face, and she told him what she had never dared speak aloud during their marriage, that she had loved him almost from the beginning, from the first time she had seen past his cold formality to the loneliness beneath, that she had hoped with each small warming between them that he might learn to care for her even a little. And as they spoke these truths that should have been shared months or years before, something shifted in the small cottage room. Some wall crumbled that had stood between them since their wedding day, and when Adrian leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against Eleanor's, both of them weeping, it felt like the true beginning of something that had been broken before it could properly start, and Eleanor whispered that she forgave him, and Adrian promised that he would spend his life proving worthy of that forgiveness and of the love she had given him so freely when he had offered her nothing but coldness in return. The weeks that followed moved with the slow gentleness of ice melting into spring water, as Eleanor's strength returned in small increments that Adrian marked with the devotion of a scholar recording precious discoveries, and he refused to leave the cottage despite Captain Hartford's gentle suggestions that he return to Thornwood and send proper staff to care for the Duchess, because Adrian had learned during those terrible vigil nights that some duties could not be delegated and some acts of penance required personal attendance, and so the proud Duke of Thornwood, who had commanded battalions and managed vast estates and moved through society with the assured authority of his rank, now spent his days performing the humble tasks of a nursemaid, bringing Eleanor broth he had heated himself over the cottage fire, reading to her from the books Hartford brought from her abandoned library at Thornwood, her favourites that Adrian now discovered for the first time, because he had never thought to ask what she loved. And he read poetry that made her smile and philosophy that sparked gentle debates when she had strength for conversation. And he learned that his wife possessed a mind as beautiful as her heart, sharp and curious and kind in its conclusions. And he mourned anew for all the conversations they might have shared during their marriage if he had not been so determined to maintain distance between them. On the mornings when Eleanor felt strong enough to sit up, Adrian would brush her hair with careful strokes, learning the weight and texture of it, the way it caught the light, and these intimate moments felt more precious than any of the formal interactions that had characterized their marriage, because now there was honesty between them, vulnerability given and received, and Eleanor would close her eyes as he worked, and sometimes tears would slip down her cheeks, though she smiled, and when Adrian asked if he was hurting her, she would shake her head and say only that she was happy, that she had dreamed of such simple tenderness during the long months of exile, but had not dared hope it might become real. And her words pierced Adrian with fresh understanding of all she had endured while he had nursed his wounded pride in Thornwood's grand halls. As Eleanor grew stronger, Adrian would help her walk, first just from the bed to the chair by the window, then around the small cottage, and finally, on a day when weak sunlight broke through winter clouds, out into the garden she had tended during her exile, and she wept to see how the cold had claimed her plantings, and Adrian promised her that spring would come, and they would plant again together, at Thornwood where she belonged. And Eleanor looked at him with such tentative hope that he understood how fragile this new beginning was, how much depended on his patience and consistency, how trust once shattered could not be commanded back into existence, but must be coaxed like a wild creature from hiding, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of that trust, no matter how long the earning required. And so he tended to Eleanor's recovery with devotion that transformed him as surely as rest and nourishment were transforming her. And in the quiet evenings when they sat by the fire, sometimes in comfortable silence, and sometimes in conversation that ranged from inconsequential observations to careful explorations of the feelings growing between them, Adrian felt something shifting in his chest, some frozen place thawing, and he recognized it as the cautious blooming of hope that perhaps from the ashes of their broken beginning they might build something true and lasting, something that honored the sacrifice Eleanor had made and the love she had offered, even when he had given her nothing but coldness in return. The journey back to Thornwood took place on a morning when the first hints of spring touched the air, when snow had begun its retreat and revealed patches of dark earth beneath. And Eleanor sat wrapped in furs within the carriage Adrian had brought, still pale but no longer fragile, her eyes drinking in the landscape she had thought never to see again. And Adrian sat across from her, unable to look away from her face, memorizing each expression that crossed it. The wonder and trepidation mingled there, because he understood that she was returning not to the cold manor she had left in disgrace, but to something unknown, and he had worked in secret during her recovery to ensure that her homecoming would be different from her banishment, that every detail would speak of honor restored and devotion offered. And when the carriage turned up the long drive to Thornwood, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the great house rising against the pale sky, Adrian watched her carefully for signs of distress, ready to turn back if this was too much too soon. But Eleanor merely reached for his hand and held it tightly, and he knew she was gathering courage for whatever awaited within those walls that had witnessed their broken beginning. The servants stood assembled in the entrance hall, not as they had stood on that terrible winter day when Eleanor had been led away in shame with averted eyes and whispered judgments, but with faces open and welcoming, and Mrs. Thornbury, the housekeeper, stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks to welcome her Grace home and to beg forgiveness for doubting her. And one by one the staff approached to offer similar words, until Eleanor wept openly at their kindness, and Adrian felt his throat tighten with gratitude that they understood what this homecoming meant and had chosen to honor it with such grace. He led Eleanor up the grand staircase, noting how she trembled with fatigue from even this small exertion, and when he opened the door to her chambers, she stopped so abruptly that he feared something was wrong. But then he saw her taking in the transformation he had ordered, the cold blue walls repainted in the warm rose she had once mentioned preferring. Her books returned to shelves and arranged by subject as she liked them, the windows fitted with new curtains that would let in the morning sun she loved, fresh flowers on every table despite the season, and Eleanor turned to him with such an expression of wonder that Adrian knew every hour spent planning these details had been worth the effort, and she whispered that it was beautiful, that it looked like a home rather than a museum, and Adrian told her softly that he wanted her to be happy here, that Thornwood had been merely a house until she had briefly made it something more, and he promised that never again would he doubt her. Never again would he allow pride or fear to blind him to her truth, and Eleanor reached up to touch his face with fingers that still trembled from weakness, and she said that she believed him. And those simple words felt like absolution and benediction both, like the first stone laid in a foundation they would build together. And later that evening, when the doctor had examined Eleanor and declared her healing well, Adrian stood with Captain Hartford in the library and accepted his friend's congratulations. But what he felt was not triumph, but humble gratitude that he had been given this undeserved second chance. And he vowed silently that he would spend whatever years remained to him proving worthy of the woman who had loved him, even when he had given her every reason not to. The woman who even now rested upstairs in rooms made beautiful for her return, in the home that was finally, truly, ready to receive her. The months that followed Eleanor's return to Thornwood unfolded with the tentative beauty of spring, revealing itself in small increments. Crocuses pushing through snow-softened earth and buds appearing on bare branches. And within the manor walls, Adrian and Eleanor moved through their days, learning the careful choreography of a relationship being built rather than assumed. Because what had existed between them before had been mere form without substance, obligation without understanding. And now they were attempting something far more difficult and precious, the creation of genuine partnership between two people who had hurt and been hurt, who carried scars that would not fade simply because forgiveness had been offered and accepted. Adrian found himself struggling with guilt that arrived in unexpected moments, when Eleanor would flinch slightly at a raised voice, though it was not directed at her, when she would grow quiet if he frowned while reading correspondence, and he understood that his anger during her banishment had left marks deeper than those visible on her too thin frame. And he was learning that rebuilding trust required not grand gestures, but consistent gentleness, required him to moderate his natural intensity, and remember that the woman who sat across from him at breakfast had learned to expect condemnation rather than care from the man who should have protected her above all others. Eleanor navigated her own difficulties in this new arrangement, uncertain sometimes whether to speak her thoughts or hold them safely inside as she had learned to do, unsure whether Adrian's attentiveness would prove lasting or fade once the novelty of his guilt wore thin. And there were moments when she would catch herself watching him warily, searching for signs of the cold duke who had sent her away. And then she would feel ashamed of her doubt because Adrian was trying so desperately to prove himself changed, and she wanted to believe in that transformation, wanted to trust that the tenderness he showed was not performance, but truth. Yet despite these stumbling attempts at understanding, there were moments of grace that gave them both hope. Mornings when Adrian would find Eleanor in the library, and they would discuss the book she was reading, until the conversation ranged across philosophy and poetry and politics, and he would marvel at how her mind worked, how she could see connections he had missed and offer insights that challenged his assumptions. And these exchanges left him feeling more alive than he had in years, made him wonder how he had been content with the silence that had characterized their early marriage when such richness had been available, if only he had asked. There were evenings when they would walk in the gardens Eleanor was restoring to their former beauty, and Adrian would take her hand with a gentleness that still surprised them both, and they would move through paths lined with early roses while twilight deepened around them. And Eleanor would speak of her plans for the estate's tenant families, the improvements she hoped to make to their cottages and schools, and Adrian would listen with attention that was not mere courtesy, but genuine interest, and he would offer resources and connections to support her vision. And in these collaborations, Eleanor began to see that she had gained not just a husband's affection, but a true partner who valued her contributions. Some nights they would sit by the fire in Eleanor's sitting room, that space Adrian had redesigned for her comfort, and conversation would stretch toward dawn as they slowly, carefully, shared the stories that had shaped them. Adrian speaking haltingly of his parents' cold marriage and his determination not to repeat their mistakes, even as he had recreated them perfectly. Eleanor describing the loneliness of her exile and the strange peace she had found in accepting what she thought was her fate. And in these revelations, they were building something neither had known to want, an intimacy of souls that went deeper than passion, though passion too was beginning to stir between them in glances held too long and touches that lingered, and both felt simultaneously the pull toward that final barrier, yet unbreached, and the fear that moving too quickly might shatter what they were so carefully constructing. And so they waited, learning patience together, trusting that when the time came, they would know it. And in the waiting, they discovered that anticipation itself could be sweet, that the slow building of desire between two people learning to love could be its own form of devotion. Adrian chose an evening in late spring, when the garden Eleanor had restored bloomed with such profusion that the air itself seemed heavy with promise, when roses climbed the ancient stone walls in cascades of cream and blush and crimson, when the last light of day gilded everything it touched, and birdsong filled the spaces between heartbeats, and he led Eleanor along paths she had designed with her own hands, past beds of lavender and stands of delphinium, to the secluded corner where a fountain murmured its endless song and stone benches waited beneath an arbor thick with honeysuckle. And Eleanor went willingly, though she sensed something significant in Adrian's barely contained nervousness, in the way his hand trembled slightly when it held hers, in the careful attention he paid to every detail of their route, as though he had rehearsed this journey many times in his mind. When they reached the arbor, and Eleanor turned to question him with eyes that reflected the golden light, Adrian took both her hands in his, and spoke words he had composed and revised and memorized until they felt true, words about how their first marriage had been a matter of duty and expectation, contracts signed and vows spoken without understanding their weight, and how he had failed her in every way a husband could fail a wife, had doubted when he should have trusted, condemned when he should have questioned, banished when he should have protected. And Eleanor began to protest that they had moved beyond such recriminations, but Adrian gently pressed on because this needed to be said, needed to be acknowledged before he could ask what he meant to ask. He spoke of her courage, not just in the sacrifice she had made to save her brother and inadvertently himself, but in the grace with which she had endured exile and near death, the generosity with which she had forgiven him, though he deserved no such mercy. And he told her that in the months since her return, he had watched her transform Thornwood from a monument to pride into a true home, had seen her gentle influence touch everything from the servants who now smiled at their work, to the tenant families whose children ran to greet her when she visited their cottages. And he understood now what he had been too blind to see before, that Eleanor possessed a strength that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, regardless of cost to herself. Then Adrian released one of her hands to withdraw a small velvet box from his pocket, and Eleanor's breath caught because she understood suddenly what was happening. And when Adrian opened the box, to reveal a ring very different from the ostentatious diamond he had given her at their first betrothal, a simple band set with her birthstone and engraved with words she could not yet read. He said that he was asking her not as the Duke of Thornwood to Lady Eleanor Ashford, not as an arrangement between families or a matter of social expectation, but as Adrian to Eleanor, as a man who had learned too late what love required and who wished desperately for the chance to offer it properly, and he asked if she would marry him again, truly this time, with full knowledge of who he was, including all his failures and weaknesses, and choose him as he was choosing her, freely and without reservation. Eleanor stood very still for a long moment, while tears gathered in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, and Adrian waited in agony, wondering if perhaps he had presumed too much, if the wounds he had inflicted ran too deep for this kind of renewal. But then Eleanor smiled with such radiance that Adrian felt his heart might stop, and she said yes, she would marry him again, that she had hoped for precisely this, though she had not dared to expect it, that she chose him with full knowledge of his faults, just as she hoped he chose her with full knowledge of hers, And when Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook with relief and joy, Eleanor read the inscription there, which said simply, "Freely chosen, wholly loved." And she understood that this was his promise and his vow, the foundation upon which they would build everything that followed. And when Adrian drew her into his arms and kissed her for the first time, not as duty or comfort, but as desire and devotion mingled, Eleanor kissed him back with all the love she had carried silently for so long, and the garden around them bore witness to this second beginning. This choice made in full light rather than shadow, and somewhere above them the first stars appeared in a sky deepening toward night. And neither noticed, because they had found in each other everything they needed, the completion of a journey that had led through darkness into light, through pain into healing, through doubt into the certainty of love freely given and gratefully received. The ceremony took place on a morning in early summer, when sunlight streamed through the chapel windows at Thornwood in golden shafts that seemed to bless everything they touched. And unlike the grand spectacle of their first wedding, with its hundreds of guests and elaborate formalities, this renewal of vows was an intimate affair, attended only by those who had witnessed their journey through darkness into light. Captain James Hartford, standing as Adrian's witness with barely concealed emotion in his weathered face. Thomas Ashford, walking his sister down the aisle with tears of joy streaming freely, because he understood better than anyone what Eleanor had sacrificed and what she had nearly lost. And a handful of servants who had remained loyal through scandal and exile, and who now gathered to celebrate what they had always hoped might come to pass. Eleanor wore not the elaborate gown of Brussels lace and seed pearls that had adorned her at their first wedding, that costume piece designed to impress society and demonstrate the Ashford family's worthiness of ducal alliance, but instead a dress of ivory silk so simple in its lines that it seemed almost plain, until one noticed how perfectly it complemented her figure. How the subtle embroidery at the hem and sleeves had been done in a pattern of honeysuckle flowers to match the arbour where Adrian had proposed, and her only adornment was the ring he had given her, and a spray of roses from her own garden woven into her hair. And she had never looked more beautiful, because her beauty now came not from artifice, but from the deep contentment that radiated from within, the peace of a woman who had survived the worst, and found herself beloved beyond measure. Adrian stood at the altar watching her approach, and found he could not contain the tears that rose because this woman walking toward him had saved his life without his knowledge, had accepted banishment rather than endanger him further, had forgiven him, though he had failed her catastrophically, and now she was choosing him again freely when she owed him nothing, and he understood with crystalline clarity that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of such grace, knowing he would always fall short, but finding purpose in the attempt. The vows they spoke were not the standard words prescribed by tradition, but promises they had written themselves in the quiet hours of dawn. Eleanor's voice steady as she pledged to trust him with her fears as well as her joys, to believe in his transformation because she had witnessed its truth in countless small moments, to build with him a life founded not on duty but on genuine partnership and abiding affection. And Adrian's voice broke as he promised to protect not just her safety but her spirit, to honor her courage by being worthy of it, to choose her every day with the same intentionality she had shown in choosing him, to love her not despite their painful history, but with the depth that history had made possible because suffering shared and overcome had forged between them a bond that easy happiness could never have created. When the chaplain pronounced them husband and wife with a trembling smile, because even he was moved by what he had witnessed, and Adrian kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that held both reverence and passion, the small gathering erupted in applause and laughter, and the celebration that followed in Thornwood's gardens was modest in scale, but rich in genuine joy. Toasts offered by Hartford and Thomas, speaking of redemption and second chances. Eleanor dancing with her brother, while Adrian watched with gratitude for the young man whose captivity had inadvertently revealed his wife's true character, And as twilight descended and lanterns were lit among the roses, and the small party continued in gentle conversation and shared happiness, Adrian and Eleanor stood together beneath the honeysuckle arbor where this new beginning had truly started, and they held each other close while around them the world softened into night, and they understood that this was not an ending, but a commencement. The first day of a marriage built on truth rather than assumption, on love freely given rather than obligation grudgingly met, and whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, partners in every sense, bound not by contracts and social expectation, but by choice renewed each day, and devotion earned through trial and proven in the fire of suffering overcome. A year had passed since their renewal of vows, when Eleanor discovered she was with child, and the joy that suffused Thornwood at this news seemed to Adrian a physical thing that brightened every corridor and touched every face with smiles, and he found himself unable to contain the fierce protectiveness that rose in him alongside a terror he had not anticipated, because now there were two lives that depended upon him, and the thought of failing either filled him with dread. But Eleanor laughed gently at his excessive caution, and reminded him that women had been bearing children since the beginning of time, and she was strong now, blooming with health in a way she had never been during their first years together, her cheeks perpetually flushed with colour and her eyes bright with contentment, and indeed, she had never looked more radiant than she did moving through the estate with her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly, while she continued her charitable work among the tenant families with Adrian's full support and frequent accompaniment, because they had become true partners in all things, consulting each other on estate matters and social obligations, sharing quiet evenings in the library where Adrian read aloud while Eleanor worked on tiny garments for the child to come. And the servants who had once moved through Thornwood with the careful silence of those who feared their master's temper, now went about their duties with genuine cheerfulness, because the house had been transformed from a monument to aristocratic pride into a true home filled with warmth and laughter. When Eleanor's time came in early spring, with the gardens just beginning to wake from winter's sleep, Adrian paced the corridor outside their bedchamber for hours, while the midwife attended his wife, and Captain Hartford sat with him, offering wordless support, because he understood that Adrian's terror came not from lack of faith, but from having learned too well how quickly joy could turn to anguish, how fragile happiness could be. And when finally the midwife emerged to announce that Eleanor had delivered a healthy daughter, and both mother and child were well, Adrian's knees nearly buckled with relief, and he rushed into the room to find Eleanor exhausted but triumphant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. And when she looked up at him with tears of happiness streaming down her face, and said their daughter had her father's dark hair, Adrian wept openly as he gathered them both carefully into his arms, and pressed his lips to Eleanor's forehead, and whispered his gratitude for this gift he had done nothing to deserve. They named the child Catherine after Eleanor's mother, and as the months passed, and Catherine grew from helpless infant into a bright-eyed baby who smiled at her parents with unmistakable recognition, Adrian marveled at how completely his life had been transformed, how the cold and bitter man he had been seemed like a stranger he could barely remember, and each evening when he returned from whatever business had called him away, he would find Eleanor in the nursery with Catherine in her arms, singing softly or telling stories in that gentle voice that had once tried so hard to reach past his defenses, and he would stand in the doorway simply watching them, his wife and daughter, this family he had nearly destroyed through pride and suspicion, and he understood with profound humility that he had been given a second chance that few men received, an opportunity to build something true and lasting from the ruins of his own failures, and he was determined to prove worthy of it through every action and choice for all the days that remained to him. 5 years had passed since Catherine's birth, when Adrian proposed they visit the cottage where their true marriage had begun, though Eleanor understood he meant the place where she had nearly died, and he had discovered the depths of his own capacity for both failure and devotion. And the journey there in early autumn was undertaken not with the desperate urgency of that winter ride, but with their 3 children, Catherine, now a bright girl of 5, and the twins, James and Margaret, just beginning to walk, accompanied by nursemaids and servants, because Adrian insisted his family travel in comfort. And as their carriage approached the small stone structure that had once been Eleanor's prison and nearly her tomb, she saw that it had been transformed entirely, the roof repaired and garden restored, fresh paint on the shutters and smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. And Adrian explained with quiet pride that he had converted it into a refuge for families facing hardship, a place where those fleeing violence or poverty or circumstances beyond their control could find temporary sanctuary. And he had named it Ashford House in Eleanor's honour, because she had shown him what true courage looked like when she had endured exile rather than compromise his safety. They toured the cottage together while the children played in the garden under watchful supervision, and Eleanor stood in the room where she had lain delirious with fever, believing she would never see Adrian again, where she had accepted death as the price of keeping him safe. And now that space had been fitted with comfortable beds and warm quilts, shelves stocked with food and medicine, everything a desperate family might need, and she found tears streaming down her face, because suffering that had once seemed senseless had been transformed into purpose. Her pain alchemized into compassion for others who walked similar paths. Adrian came to stand beside her and took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern across her knuckles that had become his habit in moments of deep feeling, and he said softly that he could never undo what he had done to her, could never erase those months of isolation and illness, but perhaps they could ensure that the place where she had suffered became a beacon of hope for others. And Eleanor turned to him with a smile radiant despite her tears, and told him that she would not change their history even if she could, because the man who had banished her in righteous fury had been transformed through remorse and humility into the husband who stood beside her now, and that transformation had been worth every moment of anguish, because it had given them something more precious than the comfortable affection their marriage might have become. It had given them a love forged in fire and proven through the hardest test, a partnership built on bedrock truth rather than surface pleasantries. They walked through the garden where Eleanor had once tended struggling plants with hands weakened by illness, and now it bloomed abundantly with vegetables and herbs for the families who would shelter here. And Catherine ran to them with flowers clutched in her small fists, while the twins toddled after their sister, and Adrian swept all 3 children into his arms with the ease of a man who had learned that strength was best measured not by dominance but by tenderness. And Eleanor watched her family together in this place where death had once seemed certain, and saw the miracle of their survival, not just her physical recovery, but the survival of love that had been buried beneath pride and suspicion, love that had needed to die and be reborn before it could truly flourish. And she understood that redemption was not a single moment, but a daily choice they made together, a commitment to honor the second chance they had been given by building something beautiful from the ashes of what they had nearly destroyed. 10 years had passed since that winter day, when Adrian had ridden through storms to find Eleanor dying in the cottage, and now they stood together in the great hall of Thornwood during the harvest celebration, surrounded by family and friends and tenants who had gathered to mark another year of prosperity and peace. And Eleanor watched her husband move through the crowd with their eldest daughter Catherine at his side, the girl now 15, and possessing her mother's gentle grace, combined with her father's quiet strength, while the twins, James and Margaret, danced with the tenant children, and little William, their youngest at just 3 years old, sat contentedly in Captain Hertford's arms, and the sight of such abundant joy, such tangible evidence of love's triumph over bitterness and suspicion, filled Eleanor with a gratitude so profound it nearly overwhelmed her, because she understood how easily this could have been lost, how close they had come to destroying something precious through pride and fear and the terrible human tendency to believe the worst rather than hoping for the best. Adrian caught her eye across the room and smiled, that particular smile he reserved only for her, the one that spoke of intimacy and understanding, and a love deepened by surviving what should have broken them. And he made his way to her side, and took her hand with the same reverence he had shown since the day he had begged her forgiveness. And together they slipped away from the celebration to walk through the gardens that Eleanor had restored from their former neglect. Gardens that now bloomed year after year as testament to the power of patient cultivation and faithful tending. And as they moved between the roses and lavender in the soft autumn twilight, Adrian spoke of his continued amazement that she had forgiven him, that she had chosen to build a life with a man who had wronged her so grievously. And Eleanor touched his face gently, and reminded him, as she had countless times before, that forgiveness was not a single act, but a daily choice. Just as love was not a feeling, but a commitment, renewed each morning when they woke together, and each evening when they blessed their children and retired to the chamber they shared as true partners in every sense. Dear listener, you who have journeyed with us through this story of betrayal and redemption, of suffering transformed into purpose and pain alchemized into profound joy. Perhaps you wonder what lessons can be drawn from Adrian and Eleanor's tale, what wisdom might be gleaned from their passage through darkness into light. And I would tell you this, that trust, once broken, requires immense courage to rebuild. But the structure that rises from acknowledged failure stands stronger than what was thoughtlessly assumed. That love tested by fire burns brighter than affection that has never known doubt. That humility is not weakness, but the foundation of all genuine connection. That the mistakes we make need not define us if we possess the courage to face them honestly and the determination to become better than we were. Consider your own life and the relationships that matter most to you. Have you allowed pride to build walls where bridges should stand, or permitted fear to silence words that needed speaking? Have you withheld forgiveness from one who truly seeks it, or failed to forgive yourself for failures that have already been pardoned by those you wronged? The path to redemption is never easy, requiring us to abandon the comfortable narrative where we are always right and others always wrong, demanding instead that we see clearly our own capacity for both cruelty and grace. But the reward for such courage is a love that cannot be shaken, because it has already survived the earthquake and been rebuilt on bedrock truth. May you find the strength to offer second chances where they are earned, the wisdom to recognize genuine remorse when it is offered, and the grace to believe that people can change, can grow, can become better than they were when they wounded you. May your nights be peaceful and your heart open to the possibility of redemption, both for yourself and for those who seek it from you. And may you discover, as Adrian and Eleanor did, that the greatest love stories are not those that unfold easily, but those that are won through patience, humility, and the fierce determination to build something true from the ruins of what was lost. This story comes to you from Channel Name, where we believe in the transformative power of second chances. If their journey moved you, consider subscribing to continue discovering tales of love, redemption, and the courage required to begin again.